Mr. Whitmore, are you certain you want the court to believe your wife was worth nothing? The question hung in the Manhattan courtroom like a thin wire pulled tight between two buildings, almost invisible but impossible to ignore once someone noticed it. Daniel Whitmore smiled before he even answered. It was the kind of smile people had seen on magazine covers and business news panels for years, the confident expression of a man who believed the world had already decided he was right. The courtroom itself carried the quiet weight of power. Dark oak benches stretched in straight lines beneath tall windows that filtered pale winter sunlight across the polished floor. Outside, traffic moved along Center Street in the steady rhythm of a New York afternoon. But inside the room, everything felt slower, heavier, like time had paused to watch what would happen next. Reporters filled the back row, their notebooks resting on their knees. A few business analysts who followed Whitmore Tech sat nearby, whispering quietly to one another. Even the courthouse clerk had glanced up twice since the hearing began, drawn by the unusual tension that seemed to wrap itself around the room. At the center of it all sat Daniel Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore Tech, a company that had grown from a modest startup into one of the fastest rising technology firms in the country. His navy suit looked perfectly tailored, the silver watch on his wrist catching the light each time he moved his hand. Everything about him suggested control. Across the aisle sat Maya Carter. She wore a simple charcoal blazer and kept her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. If someone walked in without knowing the story, they might assume she was just another professional waiting quietly for paperwork to finish. She didn't shift in her chair. She didn't glance at Daniel. She simply sat still, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. To Daniel, that silence was proof he had already won. His attorney, Harold Klein, had spent the past hour explaining to the court how Whitmore Tech had been built through Daniel's vision, Daniel's leadership, Daniel's relentless work ethic. The story sounded polished and complete, like a biography prepared for a corporate awards ceremony. According to that version of events, Maya Carter had been little more than a supportive spouse during the early years of Daniel's success. Someone who attended charity dinners, smiled for photographs, and stood beside him while he built something extraordinary. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair as his lawyer spoke, one arm resting comfortably along the back of the bench. He had heard this version of the story many times before. Investors believed it. Journalists repeated it. Even business schools sometimes mentioned Whitmore Tech as an example of how a single determined entrepreneur could build an empire. The narrative had become so familiar that Daniel no longer questioned it. When Klein finished speaking, the judge made a small note on the folder in front of her. Judge Eleanor Hayes had presided over enough corporate disputes and high-profile divorces to recognize when a case carried more beneath the surface than either side wanted to admit. She lifted her eyes slowly toward Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore," she said in a calm, measured voice, "you've testified that the success of your company is entirely the result of your work and decisions." Daniel nodded once. "That's correct, Your Honor." A faint murmur passed through the spectators. Some people had expected him to sound more cautious, but Daniel Whitmore had never built his reputation on caution. He built it on certainty. On the other side of the room, Maya's attorney, a woman named Rebecca Lawson, rose from her seat. Lawson was known in Manhattan legal circles for her patience. She rarely interrupted witnesses. She rarely raised her voice. Instead, she asked questions that seemed almost harmless until someone realized what those questions were actually revealing. Lawson walked a few steps toward the center of the room, her heels making soft echoes against the courtroom floor. She placed a thin folder on the podium and looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone polite, "you testified that your wife did not contribute to the development of Whitmore Tech." Daniel gave a small shrug, the gesture casual, almost amused. "That's right. Not in any meaningful way?" Lawson asked. Daniel chuckled quietly. The sound carried farther than he intended. "My ex-wife," he corrected, glancing briefly toward Maya before returning his attention to Lawson, "was never involved in the business." Several reporters immediately began writing. They could sense the confidence in his voice, the same confidence that had made investors trust him with millions of dollars. Maya still didn't react. She sat exactly as she had before her, eyes focused somewhere just past the judge's bench, as if the room around her were simply background noise. Lawson opened the folder slowly. So your position, she continued, is that Whitmore Tech exists today solely because of your decisions. Daniel spread his hand slightly. That's the truth. A faint smile crossed his face again. He had expected this hearing to end quickly. His financial team had already calculated the settlement he believed Maya would receive, and in the scale of his company's value, it was little more than a rounding error. A small cost for closing an old chapter. Judge Hayes watched the exchange carefully. She had seen this posture before in powerful executives who walked into courtrooms believing their reputation would carry them through any dispute. Sometimes they were right, but sometimes the truth had a way of emerging in places where even confident people couldn't control it. Lawson turned one page inside the folder and lifted a single document into view. Mr. Whitmore, she said, do you remember the first investment meeting your company ever held? Daniel frowned slightly, trying to recall the moment. That had been years ago, back when Whitmore Tech operated out of a small rented office with mismatched chairs and a borrowed conference table. Of course, he said. It was in 2012. Lawson nodded. And do you remember who prepared the financial projections that convinced those investors to fund your company? Daniel leaned forward a little now. The smile hadn't completely disappeared, but it had grown tighter around the edges. My team handled those documents, he replied. Lawson tilted her head slightly. Which team member, specifically? The question seemed simple, almost trivial. Yet the courtroom had grown noticeably quieter. Daniel hesitated for just a moment, the first pause he had shown since the hearing began. In the back row, a reporter stopped writing and looked up. Across the room, Maya Carter remained perfectly still, her hands resting calmly together on the table, as if she had already heard every answer that was about to be given. And for the first time since the hearing began, Daniel Whitmore's confident smile didn't return quite as quickly as it had before. Daniel Whitmore did not like the pause that followed Rebecca Lawson's question. For a man who had built his reputation on fast answers and decisive statements, even a few seconds of silence felt uncomfortable. He shifted slightly in his chair and cleared his throat, the sound quiet but noticeable in the stillness of the courtroom. It was a long time ago, he said, leaning back again as if the detail hardly mattered. We had several people helping with projections in the early days. Rebecca Lawson did not respond immediately. She simply looked down at the document in her hand and then lifted her eyes again, calm and patient. Several people, she repeated gently. Of course. Daniel nodded once, satisfied with the explanation. From his perspective, the moment had already passed. The small startup that once struggled to survive had grown into a corporation valued in the billions. Investors trusted him, analysts praised him, and financial magazines often described him as one of the most disciplined technology executives of his generation. A forgotten document from a decade earlier did not change that story. In the back rows, a low murmur drifted through the spectators as people leaned slightly toward one another. The reporters had begun writing again, but their pace had slowed. They were listening now, waiting for something more specific to appear beneath the surface of the testimony. Judge Eleanor Hayes rested her hands calmly on the bench in front of her. She had seen powerful executives try to smooth over inconvenient details before. Sometimes it worked. Other times it only delayed the moment when those details finally surfaced. Rebecca Lawson closed the folder halfway and placed the document carefully on the podium. Mr. Whitmore, she said, you described the early days of your company as a period when you personally handled most strategic decisions. That is correct, Daniel replied without hesitation. I founded Whitmore Tech. I built it from the ground up. His voice carried the steady confidence that had once convinced venture capital firms to invest millions of dollars into a business that existed mostly on ideas and determination. Rebecca Lawson nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the importance of that history. And during that same period, she continued, your wife Maya Carter was living with you in a one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side. Daniel shrugged lightly. We were young. That is how many companies begin. Lawson allowed a small pause before speaking again. The rent on that apartment was $2,300 a month. Daniel blinked once, surprised by the precision of the number. If you say so. I do, Lawson replied calmly. Because the lease agreement is part of the record. A few heads turned toward Maya for the first time since the hearing began, but she remained still, her gaze forward, her expression unchanged. Lawson continued. At the time Whitmore Tech had no revenue. The company had not yet secured its first investment. Daniel nodded cautiously. That is correct. Lawson placed both hands lightly on the podium. Which means the rent for that apartment, the electricity bills, the groceries, and the basic living expenses were not being paid by Whitmore Tech. Daniel frowned slightly. I do not see what this has to do with the company. It has everything to do with the company, Lawson said gently. She turned another page inside the folder. Mr. Whitmore, can you tell the court what Maya Carter's profession was during those early years? Daniel hesitated again, though the answer was simple. She worked in finance, he said finally. Lawson nodded. She worked as a financial analyst for Carter and Blake Consulting. Daniel said nothing. Lawson's voice remained steady and measured. During the first 18 months after Whitmore Tech was formed, Maya Carter's salary covered nearly all of your household expenses. Daniel shifted again, the movement small but noticeable. That was our personal arrangement. It has nothing to do with the business. Rebecca Lawson lifted the document she had placed on the podium earlier. This is a financial projection dated March 15, 2012. It was presented to investors during Whitmore Tech's first funding meeting. Daniel recognized the date immediately. He remembered the cramped conference room, the nervous excitement, the feeling that everything in his life depended on convincing a small group of investors to believe in an idea that had not yet proven itself. Lawson turned the document so the judge could see it clearly. The projections in this report estimated revenue growth for the first 3 years of the company's operations. The accuracy of those projections was one of the main reasons the investors approved funding. Daniel folded his arms loosely across his chest. Yes, that meeting changed everything. Lawson's eyes moved from the paper back to Daniel. Do you recognize the name on the bottom of this report? Daniel leaned forward slightly, his confidence thinning just enough for the change to be visible. Lawson rotated the document again, this time toward him. The signature was clear, printed neatly beneath the final page of numbers and charts. Maya Carter. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt casual or routine. It felt focused, like an audience leaning forward during the most important moment of a performance. Daniel studied the page for a second longer than necessary. She reviewed the numbers, he said finally. That does not mean she built the company. Rebecca Lawson nodded once more, as if expecting the response. You are correct, she said. Reviewing numbers does not build a company. She placed the paper back on the podium and opened the folder again. But creating the financial model that convinced investors to fund that company might be worth discussing. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained perfectly composed, her shoulders relaxed, her posture steady. She had not spoken a single word since entering the courtroom, yet the atmosphere in the room had begun to shift in a way that even the spectators could feel. Rebecca Lawson turned another page and lifted a second document. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly, before those projections were shown to investors, who prepared the financial model that calculated the company's growth strategy? Daniel did not answer immediately. The confidence that had filled the room earlier now hovered uncertainly around him, like a spotlight beginning to fade. And for the first time since the hearing began, the story Daniel Whitmore had repeated for years no longer sounded as simple as it once had. Daniel Whitmore did not answer the question right away. The silence that followed Rebecca Lawson's words seemed to stretch across the courtroom like a slow-moving shadow. For a man who had spent most of his career speaking confidently in boardrooms and investor conferences, the absence of an immediate response felt unusual. Daniel rested both hands on the table in front of him and looked briefly at the document again. The signature at the bottom of the page was unmistakable. Maya Carter. His jaw tightened slightly before he leaned back in his chair. Your Honor, he said finally, his voice controlled but firmer than before. Reviewing numbers and creating projections is not the same thing as building a company. Maya worked in finance. It was normal for her to look at spreadsheets. Rebecca Lawson listened without interrupting. Her posture remained relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the podium as if the conversation were unfolding exactly as she expected. Judge Eleanor Hayes glanced briefly at the document in front of her before looking back toward Daniel. The courtroom had grown quieter again, the spectators now fully attentive. Even the faint shuffle of papers from the back row had stopped. Lawson nodded thoughtfully. You are absolutely correct, Mr. Whitmore, she said. Reviewing numbers alone does not create a company, but the financial model behind those numbers might. She opened the folder again and removed another set of documents, placing them carefully beside the first one. The sound of the paper touching the wooden podium seemed louder than it should have been. These records come from Carter and Blake Consulting. Lawson continued calmly. They show that Maya Carter worked as a senior financial analyst specializing in growth modeling for emerging technology companies. Daniel said nothing. Lawson continued. Her work involved analyzing early-stage businesses and predicting how those companies might scale over the next 5 years. She helped investors decide whether an idea had real potential or whether it would collapse under financial pressure. Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose, as though the explanation were unnecessary. That still does not mean she built Whitmore Tech. Rebecca Lawson did not argue with him. Instead, she lifted a second page and turned it toward the judge. This document outlines the financial structure used in Whitmore Tech's first investor presentation. It shows projected revenue growth, staffing requirements, operating expenses, and capital allocation for the first 36 months. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly to examine the numbers more closely. The projections were detailed, complex, and unusually precise for a startup company that had not yet launched its first product. Lawson allowed a brief pause before speaking again. Mr. Whitmore, do you recall how long it took to create this model? Daniel frowned. No, 3 weeks, Lawson said. 3 weeks of work during evenings and weekends while Maya Carter continued working full-time at Carter and Blake Consulting. Daniel shook his head slightly, the gesture controlled but dismissive. Plenty of people helped in those early days. Lawson's voice remained steady. Yes, but according to the records from Carter and Blake Consulting, Maya Carter was the only person who built the predictive financial model used in that meeting. A faint murmur rippled through the back rows again. Daniel glanced briefly over his shoulder, clearly aware that the reporters had begun writing faster now. Rebecca Lawson turned another page inside the folder. The model predicted that Whitmore Tech could reach profitability within 32 months if the company secured at least $3 million in early investment. She paused before continuing. The investors ultimately provided $3.2 million. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. He remembered that meeting clearly. At the time it had felt like a miracle. A handful of investors had taken a risk on a company that existed mostly as a concept and a small team working out of a cramped office. Lawson continued speaking in the same calm tone. Those investors relied heavily on the financial projections presented during that meeting. The projections were considered unusually thorough for a startup company. Judge Hayes looked up from the papers. Do the records confirm who prepared the projections? Lawson nodded. Yes, Your Honor. She turned the final page and placed it beside the others. The complete financial model submitted to investors was authored by Maya Carter. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds. Daniel Whitmore stared at the documents on the podium as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. Across the aisle, Maya Carter still had not spoken. Her calm presence seemed to anchor the room in a way no one had expected when the hearing began. Daniel leaned forward again, his voice slightly sharper now. Even if that were true, it was just one document. Companies are not built on spreadsheets. Rebecca Lawson nodded gently. That is true. Companies are built by people. She glanced briefly toward Maya before continuing. But investors rarely fund companies without a clear financial plan. Daniel folded his arms again. Whitmore Tech succeeded because of the technology. Lawson tilted her head slightly. The technology did not yet exist when those projections were written. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. Judge Hayes watched the exchange closely. The shift in Daniel Whitmore's confidence was subtle but visible. The smile that had appeared earlier in the hearing had completely disappeared. Lawson continued. Mr. Whitmore, without the financial projections presented in that meeting, would investors have funded Whitmore Tech? Daniel did not answer immediately. The courtroom air felt heavier now, as if the truth of the question had settled over everyone present. Finally he spoke, though his voice carried less certainty than before. I cannot speculate on what investors might have done. Rebecca Lawson nodded slowly, acknowledging the careful wording. Of course. She gathered the documents neatly into a single stack. But the court can review the evidence. Judge Hayes glanced once more at the pages before resting her hands together on the bench. The documents will be entered into the record. Another quiet murmur passed through the spectators. Daniel Whitmore looked across the aisle toward Maya Carter for the first time since the hearing had begun. She met his glance calmly, her expression unchanged, as though the moment unfolding around them had been inevitable all along. And for the first time that afternoon, Daniel Whitmore realized that the story he had repeated for years might no longer belong entirely to him. Daniel Whitmore held Maya Carter's gaze for only a moment before looking away, but that moment lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. The quiet confidence that once filled his posture had shifted slightly, replaced by something more cautious. Around them the courtroom remained still, yet the atmosphere had changed. Earlier the hearing had felt like a routine legal proceeding, a high-profile divorce between a wealthy executive and the woman he once married. Now the room felt like a place where a story was slowly being rewritten. Rebecca Lawson gathered the documents in front of her, but did not sit down. Instead, she walked a few slow steps closer to the center of the room. Her voice remained calm and steady when she spoke again. "Mr. Whitmore, I would like to ask you about the months following that first investment meeting." Daniel adjusted his cuff slightly before answering. "What about them?" Lawson opened the folder again. After the investors approved funding, Whitmore Tech moved into its first office on West 34th Street. "Do you remember that office?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. Small space. 2 rooms and a shared conference area." Daniel gave a faint shrug. "We were just starting." Lawson continued. "The company had 8 employees at that time." Daniel looked toward her with mild impatience. "I assume all of this information is already in the record." "It is," Lawson said calmly. "But context matters." She turned another page and looked briefly at the document before raising her eyes again. During the first 6 months after the company received funding, Whitmore Tech did not yet have a full financial department. That meant someone needed to monitor spending, payroll, and operating expenses while the engineering team worked on the product. Daniel leaned back slightly. "That is typical for a startup." Lawson nodded once. "It is." She lifted another paper from the folder. "And according to the payroll records submitted to this court, Maya Carter handled those responsibilities during evenings and weekends after finishing her full-time job." Daniel exhaled quietly, as if the statement were unimportant. "She helped sometimes." Lawson did not argue. Instead, she read directly from the document in her hand. Expense tracking, vendor negotiations, early hiring projections, and quarterly budget forecasts. She lowered the page again. "That sounds like more than occasional help." Daniel's voice sharpened slightly. She was organized. She liked spreadsheets. A few reporters exchanged brief glances in the back row, but no one spoke. Judge Hayes remained silent, her attention fixed on the exchange. Lawson rested both hands on the podium again. "Mr. Whitmore, let us talk about the second investor meeting held 8 months later." Daniel frowned faintly. "I remember it. That meeting took place in Boston." Lawson continued. "Your company was requesting an additional $2 million in expansion funding." Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Lawson turned another page. "And the presentation used during that meeting included a revised growth model predicting that Whitmore Tech could double its customer base within 18 months. Daniel looked at her carefully now, as though trying to anticipate where the question was going. "That is correct." Lawson lifted the document so the judge could see the heading printed across the top. This updated financial model was also prepared by Maya Carter. Daniel's lips pressed together slightly. She ran the numbers. Lawson tilted her head. "She built the model." Daniel did not respond. Lawson allowed the silence to linger for a few seconds before continuing. "Mr. Whitmore, do you remember what the investors said after reviewing that model?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Lawson glanced briefly toward the judge. According to the meeting transcript, one of the investors described the projections as unusually disciplined for a startup company. She turned another page and read directly from the record. Quote, "Whoever prepared this model understands both risk and growth strategy." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Lawson closed the folder halfway, but did not remove her hand from it. That meeting resulted in Whitmore Tech receiving the additional funding. Daniel looked toward the window for a moment before returning his attention to her. "Investors believed in the technology." Lawson nodded. "Yes, but they invested after reviewing the financial projections." Daniel's voice grew firmer. "You are trying to suggest that Maya built the company." Lawson's expression remained neutral. No, Mr. Whitmore. She paused briefly before finishing the sentence. I am suggesting that the court understand the full story. Judge Hayes leaned back slightly in her chair, considering the documents in front of her. The quiet tension in the courtroom had become unmistakable now. The reporters were writing quickly, their pens moving in sharp bursts across their notebooks. Rebecca Lawson spoke again, her voice measured and calm. Mr. Whitmore, during the early years of Whitmore Tech, how many hours per week did you work? Daniel answered immediately. 80. Sometimes more. Lawson nodded thoughtfully. And during those same years Maya Carter worked full-time as a financial analyst while also assisting with the company's financial planning. Daniel remained silent. Lawson closed the folder completely and placed it on the podium. For nearly 3 years, she helped build the financial framework that allowed Whitmore Tech to survive its early stages. Daniel looked down at the table in front of him for a moment. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her hands still folded calmly together. Lawson took a step back from the podium, but continued speaking. Yet when this court first heard your testimony today, you described Maya Carter as someone who did not contribute to the success of your company. Daniel did not answer. The silence in the room deepened again, stretching across the courtroom like a quiet acknowledgement that something important had shifted. Judge Hayes looked from the documents to Daniel Whitmore and then briefly toward Maya Carter. The hearing had begun with a confident executive certain that his story was simple and uncontested. But as the evidence continued to unfold, that story was beginning to look far more complicated than anyone in the courtroom had expected. Daniel Whitmore sat motionless as the quiet in the courtroom deepened around him. Only an hour earlier he had walked into the room with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. Now the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if every word spoken in the past few minutes had slowly shifted the ground beneath his feet. Rebecca Lawson remained standing near the podium, calm and patient, the stack of documents resting neatly in front of her. Judge Eleanor Hayes looked down briefly at the record before lifting her eyes again. Counselor, she said evenly, you may continue. Lawson nodded once. She did not rush. Instead, she opened the folder again with deliberate care, turning a few pages as though giving the room time to absorb what had already been revealed. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same measured tone that had guided the hearing from the beginning. Mr. Whitmore, we have discussed the early financial structure of Whitmore Tech and the projections that secured your first investments. I would now like to discuss the company's first year of operations. Daniel folded his hands together on the table. What about it? Lawson glanced briefly at the document before answering. The first year was difficult. According to company records, Whitmore Tech did not generate meaningful revenue for nearly 11 months. Daniel gave a small nod. Most startups take time to grow. That is true, Lawson said. But during those 11 months your company came very close to running out of operating capital. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. We managed it. Lawson lifted another document from the folder. Yes, because a new budget plan was created to reduce spending and extend the company's runway. She turned the page so the judge could see the heading clearly. This document is dated January 14, 2013. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, examining the page. What does it show? Lawson answered calmly. It outlines a restructuring plan that reduced operational costs by 30% without eliminating key engineering positions. She paused briefly before adding. The plan allowed Whitmore Tech to continue operating long enough to release its first product. Daniel shifted in his chair. That was a team effort. Lawson inclined her head slightly. Yes, but the author of the restructuring plan is identified on the final page. Daniel said nothing. The spectators behind him leaned forward almost imperceptibly, their attention fixed on the document now resting on the podium. Lawson lifted the page and spoke clearly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Prepared by Maya Carter. The silence returned again, heavier this time. Daniel looked toward the ceiling for a moment, as if searching for patience before lowering his gaze back toward the table. She helped with budgeting, he said. Lawson did not challenge the statement. Instead, she placed the page beside the earlier documents. The restructuring plan also included a hiring schedule, a vendor renegotiation strategy, and a forecast showing that the company could remain solvent for 9 additional months. She glanced toward the judge again. Without that adjustment, Whitmore Tech would have exhausted its available capital by early spring. Judge Hayes rested her hands together thoughtfully, and the company would not have survived long enough to launch its product. Lawson nodded. That is correct, Your Honor. Daniel leaned forward slightly now, his voice controlled but sharper. Your Honor, this is being presented as if Maya Carter personally ran the company. That is not accurate. Judge Hayes looked at him calmly. Mr. Whitmore, the court is reviewing the evidence. You will have an opportunity to respond. Daniel sat back again, but the confidence he had displayed earlier no longer returned as easily. Rebecca Lawson allowed the moment to settle before continuing. Mr. Whitmore, when the restructuring plan was implemented, how many employees worked at Whitmore Tech? Daniel answered quickly. 12. And what was your role at the time? Chief Executive Officer. Lawson nodded slightly, which meant you were responsible for approving the plan before it was implemented. Daniel hesitated. Yes. Lawson stepped slightly to the side of the podium. And you approved the plan prepared by Maya Carter. Daniel did not respond immediately. I approved the numbers that worked, he said finally. Lawson's expression remained neutral. Numbers that allowed the company to continue operating. Daniel's voice softened slightly, though he still sounded defensive. We needed a plan. Lawson glanced briefly toward Maya before continuing. And Maya Carter created one. Daniel looked across the aisle again, this time holding Maya's gaze for a second longer. She remained completely composed, her calm presence contrasting sharply with the tension beginning to show in his posture. Lawson turned another page inside the folder. During the months following that restructuring plan, Whitmore Tech released its first software platform. Daniel nodded. Yes. And the company's customer base grew rapidly. That is correct. Lawson placed the final document on the podium beside the others. Within 12 months, Whitmore Tech had become profitable. The reporters in the back row were writing continuously now, their pens moving quickly as the narrative unfolded. Lawson spoke again, her tone steady and clear. Mr. Whitmore, when investors and journalists later asked how your company survived its difficult first year, how did you usually answer that question? Daniel remained silent for a moment before responding. Hard work. Lawson nodded. Your hard work. Daniel did not argue with the statement. Lawson closed the folder slowly. Yet the financial model that secured the first investment, the restructuring plan that prevented the company from collapsing, and the budgeting strategy that guided its first year were all created by Maya Carter. The quiet in the courtroom seemed almost absolute now. Daniel Whitmore looked down at the polished wooden table in front of him, the reflection of the courtroom lights faintly visible in its surface. For years he had told the same story about how Whitmore Tech had been built. Investors believed it. Journalists repeated it. Business magazines printed it beneath photographs of him standing confidently in glass office towers overlooking the city. But as the documents continued to appear one after another, that story was beginning to change in front of everyone watching. And for the first time since the hearing began, the success of Whitmore Tech no longer looked like the achievement of one man alone. The quiet that followed Rebecca Lawson's last statement lingered in the courtroom like a weight that no one wanted to disturb. Daniel Whitmore kept his eyes on the table in front of him, the reflection of the overhead lights stretching across the polished wood like thin silver lines. A few minutes earlier he had still believed that the story of Whitmore Tech belonged entirely to him. Now that story was slowly unfolding in ways he had not anticipated. Judge Eleanor Hayes adjusted the documents in front of her and looked toward Rebecca Lawson. Counselor, she said evenly. Please continue. Lawson nodded once. She did not rush to speak. Instead, she allowed a brief moment of silence to settle across the room before lifting another document from the folder on the podium. Your Honor, she said calmly. The court has now reviewed the financial models and restructuring plans that allowed Whitmore Tech to survive its first year. I would now like to discuss what happened after the company began to succeed. Daniel finally looked up again, though the confidence that once filled his posture had grown noticeably restrained. Lawson continued in the same steady voice. By late 2014, Whitmore Tech had grown from 12 employees to more than 80. The company moved from its small office on West 34th Street into a much larger building in Midtown Manhattan. Daniel nodded slightly. That is correct. Lawson turned another page inside the folder. The company also secured a new round of funding that valued Whitmore Tech at nearly $60 million. Daniel leaned back again, his voice returning to a more familiar firmness. That is when the company truly began expanding. Lawson inclined her head. Yes. She paused before adding, that expansion required a much larger financial infrastructure. Daniel folded his hands together. We hired a finance team. Lawson lifted another page. You hired a chief financial officer and 3 financial analysts. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Lawson glanced briefly toward Maya Carter before continuing. But according to the internal hiring records submitted to this court, Maya Carter interviewed each candidate personally. Daniel's expression shifted slightly. She was familiar with the company's finances. Lawson placed the page carefully on the podium. She also designed the evaluation process used to select the financial team. Daniel said nothing. The reporters in the back row continued writing quickly, their pens moving across their notebooks with renewed urgency. Lawson spoke again, her voice steady and clear. During that same period, Whitmore Tech also began negotiating partnerships with several larger technology firms. Daniel nodded once more. Those partnerships helped accelerate growth. Lawson lifted another document. The negotiation strategy used in those partnerships included a revenue-sharing model that protected Whitmore Tech's long-term intellectual property rights. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. That was part of our business strategy. Lawson's eyes moved calmly from the paper back to Daniel. That strategy was also drafted by Maya Carter. Another quiet murmur passed through the spectators. Daniel glanced briefly toward the back of the courtroom before turning back toward Lawson. Your Honor, he said carefully, Maya understood financial structures. That does not mean she ran the company. Judge Hayes watched him for a moment before responding. Mr. Whitmore, the court is not drawing conclusions yet. We are reviewing evidence. Daniel nodded slowly, though his expression remained tense. Rebecca Lawson continued. Mr. Whitmore, by the time Whitmore Tech reached 100 employees, your company had become one of the fastest-growing startups in the region. Daniel gave a small nod. Yes. Lawson turned another page. At that time, several business magazines began writing about your success. Daniel's expression softened slightly as he remembered those articles. The photographs, the interviews, the praise describing him as an innovative founder who had built a remarkable company from nothing more than determination and vision. Lawson continued quietly. Many of those articles described Whitmore Tech as the achievement of a single visionary entrepreneur. Daniel did not respond, but the faint tension in his shoulders was visible. Lawson closed the folder halfway and rested her hand lightly on top of it. Mr. Whitmore, when journalists asked you how the company had grown so quickly, did you ever mention Maya Carter's role in building the financial structure that supported that growth? Daniel looked down again for a moment before answering. Those interviews focused on the technology. Lawson nodded slightly. Of course. She paused briefly before continuing. But the technology alone could not have expanded the company without the financial strategies we have discussed. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained composed, her posture unchanged, her calm presence steady even as the narrative surrounding the company continued to evolve. Lawson opened the folder again and removed one final document. This report was prepared by an external consulting firm during Whitmore Tech's 3rd year of operation. She turned the page so the judge could read the heading. It evaluates the financial systems used by the company during its early growth period. Judge Hayes studied the document carefully. Lawson continued. The consultants concluded that Whitmore Tech's early financial infrastructure was unusually sophisticated for a startup company. Daniel remained silent. Lawson's voice remained steady as she read the final line from the report. Quote, the company's financial architecture suggests the involvement of a highly experienced financial strategist during its formative years. She lowered the paper and placed it beside the others. That strategist was Maya Carter. The courtroom fell silent again. The story that had once seemed simple now appeared far more complex than anyone in the room had expected when the hearing began. Daniel Whitmore sat very still, his hands resting on the table, as if he were carefully measuring each thought before allowing it to surface. And as the evidence continued to accumulate, the empire he once claimed as his alone now looked increasingly like the result of 2 minds working together during the years when success was still uncertain. The quiet after Rebecca Lawson's final statement seemed to stretch across the courtroom like a slow wave moving through still water. Daniel Whitmore sat motionless for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the documents arranged across the polished surface of the table. The stack had grown thicker with each revelation, and with every page the story he had told the world for years seemed to lose a little more of its certainty. Judge Eleanor Hayes watched the room carefully. Years of presiding over complicated cases had taught her how to read moments like this one. It was the moment when confidence began to give way to reflection, when a narrative that once appeared simple slowly unfolded into something far more layered. She glanced toward Rebecca Lawson. "Counselor," she said evenly, "you may proceed." Lawson nodded once and stepped forward again, the folder resting in her hands. Her voice remained calm, almost conversational, yet every word carried clearly through the silent room. "Your Honor, the court has now reviewed Maya Carter's contributions during the early growth of Whitmore Tech. I would like to focus briefly on the period when the company first became widely recognized." Daniel lifted his eyes again, though the relaxed confidence he once carried had grown noticeably restrained. Lawson continued. In early 2015, Whitmore Tech released the second version of its platform. That release attracted significant attention from major technology publications. Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes, that was an important moment for the company." Lawson opened the folder and removed another document. Following that release, Whitmore Tech's valuation increased dramatically. She glanced at the page before continuing. Within 6 months, the company was valued at more than $200 million. A few quiet whispers passed through the back row. Daniel's voice regained a trace of its earlier firmness. The product was strong. Lawson inclined her head. "Yes, but rapid growth creates new challenges." Daniel remained silent. Lawson lifted another page. During that same period, the company faced a major financial decision regarding how to scale its infrastructure without exhausting its capital. Daniel frowned slightly. "We needed to expand carefully." Lawson nodded. "Exactly." She turned the page so the judge could read the heading. This strategic plan outlined 3 possible growth paths. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly to examine the document. Lawson continued speaking with the same measured tone. Option 1 required heavy borrowing and carried significant financial risk. Option 2 slowed expansion but reduced risk. Option 3 balanced growth with long-term financial stability. Daniel's gaze moved slowly across the page as though he recognized the numbers appearing there. Lawson continued. The plan recommended option 3. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. That was the correct choice. Lawson's eyes moved from the paper back to him. "Yes, it was." She paused briefly before finishing the thought. "The recommendation was written by Maya Carter." Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but noticeable in the quiet room. The reporters in the back row continued writing steadily now, capturing each new detail as the narrative expanded. Lawson placed the page on the podium beside the others. "Mr. Whitmore, when the company's valuation reached $200 million, Whitmore Tech began preparing for another round of funding." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Lawson turned another page inside the folder. "That funding round ultimately raised $40 million. Daniel's voice carried a trace of pride despite the tension surrounding him. "Investors believed in the future of the company." Lawson nodded slightly. "And those investors reviewed a detailed financial strategy before committing their capital." Daniel did not respond. Lawson lifted the next document and turned it toward the judge. "This report contains the long-term financial roadmap presented to those investors." Judge Hayes studied the document carefully. Lawson continued quietly. "The roadmap predicted how Whitmore Tech could grow from a startup into a billion-dollar company within 5 years." Daniel's gaze dropped to the table again. Lawson's voice remained calm and steady as she finished the explanation. "That roadmap was also created by Maya Carter." The silence that followed seemed even heavier than before. Daniel Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair, his hands resting together as though he were carefully measuring every word that had been spoken. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained composed, her calm presence unchanged despite the growing attention focused on her role in the company's success. Rebecca Lawson stepped slightly away from the podium, but did not sit down. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "the court has reviewed several documents today that illustrate Maya Carter's involvement in the financial architecture of Whitmore Tech." Daniel looked toward her again, though the confident smile that once appeared so easily had not returned. Lawson continued, "Yet when this hearing began, you described Maya Carter as someone who had little involvement in the company's success." Daniel remained silent for several seconds before answering quietly. "She was never an official executive." Lawson nodded slowly. "That is correct." She paused before adding, "But the evidence shows that she shaped many of the financial strategies that allowed Whitmore Tech to grow." Judge Hayes rested her hands together on the bench once more, observing the exchange with careful attention. Daniel Whitmore looked briefly across the aisle again. Maya Carter met his glance with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the hearing. There was no anger in her face, no satisfaction either, only a quiet steadiness that seemed to anchor the room. For years Daniel had stood before investors, journalists, and conference audiences describing how he built Whitmore Tech from nothing more than determination and vision. But as the documents continued to accumulate, that story was no longer standing alone. And in the quiet space of the courtroom, the woman he once described as having little role in the company's success was beginning to appear not as a footnote in the story, but as one of the architects who helped make the entire empire possible. Daniel Whitmore remained seated with his hands folded in front of him, but the stillness in his posture no longer looked like confidence. It looked like calculation. For most of his career, he had been a man who understood how to control a room. Boardrooms, investor meetings, industry conferences, even television interviews had all followed the same rhythm. Daniel spoke, people listened, and the story moved forward exactly the way he intended. But inside the quiet walls of the Manhattan courtroom, that rhythm had begun to shift. Rebecca Lawson stood calmly beside the podium, her folder closed now, as though she had already said everything she needed to say. Judge Eleanor Hayes glanced briefly at the clock on the wall before returning her attention to the table in front of her. The silence stretching through the room was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate, the kind of pause that allowed a truth to settle before the next piece of it appeared. Daniel finally lifted his head. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but more restrained than earlier, "I would like to clarify something." Judge Hayes nodded slightly. "You may respond." Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the table. No one is denying that Maya worked with financial projections in the early days of the company. She had experience in finance. That was helpful. His eyes briefly moved toward Maya before returning to the judge. "But Whitmore Tech exists because I built the product. I led the engineering team. I secured partnerships. I carried the risk when no one else believed the company would survive." The words were familiar to him. He had said them in different forms many times before, and for years they had been accepted without question. Judge Hayes listened without interruption. When Daniel finished speaking, she turned her attention toward Rebecca Lawson. "Counselor." Lawson opened the folder again slowly, as if she had anticipated the response. "Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore is correct about one thing." Daniel looked toward her, his expression tightening slightly. Lawson continued calmly. "Whitmore Tech's success required many different elements: technology, leadership, investment, and careful financial planning." She paused briefly before lifting a single document from the folder. "The court has already reviewed evidence regarding Maya Carter's financial work during the company's early growth. However, there is one more detail that has not yet been discussed." The reporters in the back row leaned forward again, sensing the direction of the conversation. Lawson placed the document on the podium. "Mr. Whitmore, do you remember the night before the first major investor meeting in 2012? Daniel frowned slightly, surprised by the question. "That was more than a decade ago." Lawson nodded. "Yes, but the events of that evening are documented." She turned the page so the judge could see the heading. "This is an email exchange dated March 14, 2012. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he tried to recall the moment. Lawson continued. "At 10:42 that night you sent an email to Maya Carter." She read directly from the page. Quote, "The projections are not working. Investors will not believe these numbers." Daniel's expression remained controlled, though the tension in his shoulders had become visible again. Lawson continued reading. At 11:18 Maya Carter replied with a revised financial model attached to the email. She lifted the next page. The revised model is the same document presented to investors the following morning. The quiet in the courtroom deepened once again. Daniel leaned back slowly, his gaze moving from the paper to the far wall, as if the memory had finally surfaced. Lawson spoke gently. Mr. Whitmore, according to your own email you wrote that the revised projections saved the meeting. Daniel did not respond immediately. The faint sound of a pen scratching across paper in the back row seemed unusually loud in the stillness. Lawson continued. Those revised projections were prepared overnight by Maya Carter. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Across the aisle, Maya remained composed, her posture unchanged, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. Lawson closed the email record and placed it beside the other documents. Mr. Whitmore, the court is not suggesting that you did not work hard to build your company. Daniel looked toward her again. Lawson continued, her voice steady. But the evidence shows that Maya Carter played a far more significant role in Whitmore Tech's early survival than you originally described. Judge Hayes looked carefully at the documents before lifting her gaze again. The weight of the evidence was beginning to shape the room itself. What had once appeared to be a straightforward divorce case had quietly transformed into a deeper examination of the truth behind a corporate success story. Daniel Whitmore remained silent now, his thoughts moving behind a carefully controlled expression. For years he had been celebrated as the lone architect of Whitmore Tech's rise. But with each new document placed before the court, the story continued to widen, revealing that the foundation of that success had been built by more than one pair of hands. And as the courtroom absorbed the growing evidence, the quiet woman seated across from him no longer looked like someone who had simply stood beside the empire. She looked increasingly like someone who had helped design it. The quiet weight of the courtroom seemed to deepen after the email was read into the record. For several seconds no one spoke. Even the reporters in the back row slowed their writing, their attention fixed on the two people sitting across from each other at the center of the room. Daniel Whitmore rested his hands together on the polished table, his posture still controlled, but the expression on his face had changed. The certainty that once filled his voice earlier in the hearing had softened into something more guarded. Judge Eleanor Hayes glanced again at the documents arranged in front of her before lifting her eyes toward Rebecca Lawson. "Counselor," she said calmly, "you may continue." Rebecca Lawson stepped forward once more, the folder still in her hands. Her voice remained steady, but there was a quiet sense of momentum behind her words now, as though each new piece of information was revealing another layer of a story that had remained hidden for years. "Your Honor," she said, "the court has now reviewed Maya Carter's role in the financial models, restructuring plans, and strategic projections that supported Whitmore Tech during its early development. I would now like to address one final aspect of the company's growth." Daniel looked toward her again, his brow tightening slightly. Lawson opened the folder slowly and removed a thin document. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "do you remember the meeting that took place with Horizon Venture Capital in late 2016? Daniel nodded once. "Of course." Lawson continued. "That meeting resulted in one of the largest investments Whitmore Tech had received up to that point." Daniel's voice returned with a trace of firmness. "Yes, Horizon invested $80 million. A faint murmur passed through the back rows again. Lawson placed the document on the podium. Before that meeting occurred, Horizon requested a complete review of Whitmore Tech's financial architecture. Daniel nodded again. "They wanted to verify our long-term sustainability." Lawson glanced at the page. "Exactly." She paused briefly before continuing. "The investors specifically asked who designed the company's financial infrastructure during its earliest stages." Daniel did not immediately answer. Lawson lifted the document so that the judge could see the highlighted section near the bottom. This report was prepared by Horizon's internal review team after they completed their evaluation. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Lawson read the sentence clearly. Quote, "Whitmore Tech's financial framework demonstrates the work of a strategist with exceptional long-term forecasting ability." She paused before reading the next line. "The review attributes the design of that framework to Maya Carter." The silence in the courtroom settled again like a slow-moving tide. Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose and looked toward the window for a brief moment before turning back toward the podium. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "investors often rely on consultants and analysts during reviews. That statement does not mean Maya controlled the company." Rebecca Lawson nodded gently. "You are correct, Mr. Whitmore." She folded her hands lightly over the folder. "But Horizon Venture Capital's report included a follow-up recommendation. Daniel watched her carefully now. Lawson turned the page. The report advised that Maya Carter should be formally recognized as the architect of Whitmore Tech's financial systems. The reporter's pens moved quickly again, capturing every word. Lawson continued reading. Quote, failure to acknowledge this contribution creates a misleading narrative regarding the company's leadership structure. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained composed, her calm expression unchanged even as the room's attention shifted more clearly toward her role in the company's past. Lawson placed the document beside the others. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly, did you follow that recommendation? Daniel looked down at the table again for several seconds before answering. No, Lawson did not react immediately. She allowed the single word to linger in the air. Instead, she continued, Whitmore Tech continued presenting its growth story as the work of a single founder. Daniel leaned back slowly, his hands resting against the edge of the chair. That is how many companies present themselves. Lawson inclined her head slightly. Yes. She paused before adding, but the court is not reviewing marketing narratives. The court is reviewing the truth. Judge Hayes looked again at the growing collection of documents that now covered much of the podium's surface. Financial models, investor reports, strategic plans, each one connected to the same quiet figure sitting calmly across the aisle. Daniel Whitmore finally turned his head toward Maya Carter again. For the first time since the hearing began, his expression carried something more complicated than confidence or frustration. It carried recognition. Maya met his glance briefly, her expression steady and calm. There was no triumph in her face, no bitterness either. Only the quiet composure of someone who had spent years watching the story unfold from the background. Rebecca Lawson stepped back from the podium, allowing the moment to settle across the courtroom. For years, Whitmore Tech had been celebrated as the achievement of a single visionary entrepreneur. Investors believed it. Journalists repeated it. Industry conferences introduced Daniel Whitmore as the architect of a billion-dollar technology company. But inside the quiet walls of the courtroom, the narrative had begun to change. Page by page, document by document, the story that once seemed simple was revealing a far deeper truth. And as that truth continued to emerge, the woman who had sat silently beside the company for years was no longer appearing as a supporting figure in the story of Whitmore Tech's rise. She was beginning to look like the mind that had quietly shaped the foundation beneath the entire empire. The courtroom remained quiet after Rebecca Lawson finished reading from the Horizon Venture Capital report. The words had settled over the room like a slow echo that refused to fade. Daniel Whitmore sat still with his hands resting on the table, but the confidence that once defined his posture earlier in the hearing had become noticeably restrained. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained calm, her expression unchanged, her presence steady despite the growing attention focused on the role she had played in building the financial structure of Whitmore Tech. Judge Eleanor Hayes glanced over the stack of documents in front of her once more. Financial models, restructuring plans, investor reports, and email records now formed a detailed timeline of the company's early development. She lifted her eyes again toward Rebecca Lawson. Counselor, she said evenly, you indicated there was one final matter the court should review. Rebecca Lawson nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. She stepped closer to the podium again and opened the folder that had accompanied her throughout the hearing. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if she understood that the moment unfolding in the courtroom had been building toward this point from the very beginning. Daniel watched her carefully now, his brow faintly drawn together. Lawson removed a thin envelope from the folder and placed it gently on the podium. Mr. Whitmore, she said calmly, I would like to discuss an agreement that was signed during the early days of your marriage. Daniel's expression changed slightly. What agreement? Lawson opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. This document was signed on June 2, 2011, several months before Whitmore Tech secured its first investment. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. What kind of agreement? Lawson turned the document so that the judge could see the heading clearly. A marital partnership agreement. The quiet in the courtroom deepened again. Daniel's shoulders stiffened slightly as he looked toward the paper. Lawson continued speaking with the same steady tone. At that time, Mr. Whitmore had recently begun developing the concept that would eventually become Whitmore Tech. She paused briefly before adding, but the company did not yet exist as a formal business entity. Daniel spoke carefully now. Many couples sign agreements when they get married. Lawson nodded. Yes, they do. She lifted the paper and read a line from the document. The agreement states that both parties acknowledge the creation of any future business ventures during the marriage as a shared economic partnership. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. That language is standard. Lawson continued reading. It also states that any intellectual or financial architecture developed for those ventures will be considered part of the shared partnership. The reporters in the back row began writing quickly again. Daniel looked toward the judge. Your Honor, that document simply reflects our marriage at the time. Rebecca Lawson placed the paper carefully beside the other documents already on the podium. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. It reflects your marriage. She paused before continuing. But it also reflects the understanding that existed when Whitmore Tech was first being built. Daniel said nothing. Lawson spoke again. During the past several hours, this court has reviewed extensive evidence showing Maya Carter's involvement in the financial planning, investment strategy, and structural design of Whitmore Tech's early development. Judge Hayes looked thoughtfully at the document. Lawson continued. The partnership agreement signed in 2011 recognized that both of you were contributing to the creation of future ventures during your marriage. Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose. That does not mean she owns the company. Lawson's expression remained calm. Ownership is not the question before the court today. She gestured slightly toward the stack of evidence. The question is whether Maya Carter's contributions carried measurable value. The room remained silent. Lawson continued in the same measured voice. Mr. Whitmore, the financial architecture Maya Carter created allowed Whitmore Tech to secure its first investment, survive its first year, scale responsibly, and attract additional funding. Daniel looked down at the table again. Lawson lifted another document from the folder. This final report was prepared by an independent valuation firm hired by the court. Judge Hayes accepted the paper and began reviewing it carefully. Lawson spoke quietly as the judge read. The firm was asked to evaluate the long-term value created by the financial systems designed during Whitmore Tech's earliest development. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge continued reading through the report. After several moments, Judge Hayes lowered the paper and looked toward Rebecca Lawson. Counselor, are you prepared to summarize the report's conclusion? Lawson nodded. Yes, Your Honor. She turned slightly toward the courtroom before speaking clearly. The independent analysis concluded that the financial architecture developed by Maya Carter increased the long-term enterprise value of Whitmore Tech by several $100 million. A quiet wave of whispers moved through the back rows before quickly fading again. Daniel Whitmore remained still, though the expression on his face now carried something very different from the confidence he displayed when the hearing first began. Rebecca Lawson finished her explanation calmly. In other words, the systems Maya Carter designed were not minor contributions. They were foundational elements that helped transform Whitmore Tech from an idea into a global technology company. Judge Hayes looked again at the report in front of her before setting it down beside the other documents. The room had become so quiet that the faint hum of the courthouse ventilation system could be heard overhead. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes across the aisle toward Maya Carter. She met his gaze once more, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had never expected the recognition unfolding around her. And as the final report rested on the judge's desk beside the growing stack of evidence, the story that Daniel Whitmore had carried for years was no longer standing alone in the courtroom. The truth behind Whitmore Tech's success had finally been laid out in full view of everyone watching. The courtroom remained suspended in a quiet stillness after the independent valuation report was placed before the judge. The final number inside that report seemed to echo through the room even after the words themselves had faded. Hundreds of millions of dollars. That figure did not simply represent money. It represented recognition, influence, and the quiet power of decisions made long before Whitmore Tech ever appeared on the cover of a business magazine. Daniel Whitmore sat with his shoulders slightly lowered now, his hands resting flat against the polished surface of the table. Earlier in the hearing, his posture had carried the confidence of a man accustomed to control. But control had gradually slipped away as document after document revealed a deeper truth behind the story he had repeated for years. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained composed, her calm presence unchanged even as the courtroom absorbed the significance of the report. Judge Eleanor Hayes read through the final page again before placing it carefully on the desk in front of her. The room remained silent as she considered the documents that now formed a complete timeline of Whitmore Tech's origin. Financial projections written in the early months of uncertainty. Strategic plans that guided the company through its fragile first year. Investor reports acknowledging the brilliance of a financial architecture that allowed the company to grow without collapsing under its own ambition. Every page pointed to the same conclusion. Rebecca Lawson stood quietly beside the podium, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the folder that had carried the evidence through the entire hearing. She did not rush to speak. She knew the moment belonged to the court now. After several seconds, Judge Hayes lifted her eyes toward Daniel Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore," she said evenly, "the court has reviewed a significant amount of documentation today." Daniel looked toward her slowly. The faint reflection of the courtroom lights moved across his watch as he shifted his wrist slightly against the table. Judge Hayes continued in a steady voice. "Throughout this hearing you have described Whitmore Tech as the product of your leadership and your vision." Daniel nodded once, though the gesture lacked the certainty it once carried. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Hayes folded her hands together. Leadership and vision are important qualities in any successful enterprise. She paused briefly before continuing. However, the evidence presented today demonstrates that the financial architecture supporting Whitmore Tech was created through the work of Maya Carter. The words were not spoken loudly, yet they carried across the entire room. Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed on the judge as she continued. Financial systems determine whether a company survives long enough for its technology to succeed. Judge Hayes glanced briefly at the documents again. In this case, those systems appear to have been designed with extraordinary foresight. Rebecca Lawson allowed a small breath to escape as the statement settled over the courtroom. For the first time since the hearing began, the conversation had shifted away from arguments and evidence toward acknowledgement. Judge Hayes turned her attention briefly toward Maya Carter. "Ms. Carter, you have remained silent throughout these proceedings." Maya inclined her head slightly, but did not speak. The quiet dignity in her posture seemed to anchor the room in a way that no argument could replicate. Judge Hayes continued speaking, though her voice remained calm and deliberate. "The court recognizes that many contributions to a company's success occur outside the public eye." She looked again toward Daniel Whitmore. "In this case, the documentation shows that those contributions were substantial." Daniel finally shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers tightening briefly before relaxing again. For years he had been introduced at conferences as the architect of a technology empire. The phrase had followed him through interviews, press releases, and keynote speeches. Yet here, inside the quiet walls of the courtroom, that title had begun to expand to include someone he once described as merely standing beside the company. Judge Hayes returned her attention to the valuation report resting near the center of her desk. The independent analysis submitted to this court concludes that the financial systems created by Maya Carter added extraordinary value to Whitmore Tech's long-term enterprise growth. She paused again before finishing the thought. The court takes that analysis seriously. In the back row, the reporters were no longer whispering. Their pens moved steadily as they recorded every word. Daniel Whitmore remained silent now, though the expression on his face had shifted from resistance to something more reflective. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained exactly as she had been throughout the hearing. Calm, steady, unmoved by the sudden attention now directed toward her role in the company's history. Rebecca Lawson stepped slightly away from the podium, giving the judge a clear view of the entire courtroom. For years, Whitmore Tech had been described as the creation of one man's ambition. But the evidence now resting on the judge's desk had revealed a far more complete story. A story built not only on vision and leadership, but on careful planning, disciplined forecasting, and a financial structure strong enough to support the weight of a growing empire. And as that story settled over the courtroom like a quiet realization shared by everyone present, the woman who had spent years in the background of that success was finally being recognized for the role she had played in shaping it. The quiet in the courtroom remained unbroken for several long seconds after Judge Eleanor Hayes finished speaking. The words she had chosen were careful, deliberate, and measured, yet their meaning was unmistakable to everyone present. What had begun as a routine divorce hearing had slowly transformed into something much larger. It had become a public unraveling of a story that the business world had accepted for years without question. Daniel Whitmore sat very still at the table, his fingers loosely interlocked. In front of him, earlier that morning he had entered the courtroom with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the proceedings would confirm the narrative he had always told. But now the air in the room felt different. The documents on the judge's desk had quietly reshaped that narrative piece by piece, revealing that the foundation of Whitmore Tech's success had been built on more than one mind. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained composed, her posture straight and calm. She had spoken almost nothing throughout the hearing, yet the evidence presented in the room had given her a presence far stronger than any argument could have created. Judge Hayes looked again at the collection of documents arranged before her. Financial projections, strategic plans, investor evaluations. The independent valuation report rested near the center of the stack, its conclusion already echoing through the room. The systems Maya Carter had designed had increased the enterprise value of Whitmore Tech by hundreds of millions of dollars. Judge Hayes folded her hands together thoughtfully. The courtroom remained silent as she began to speak again. This court was originally asked to determine the financial outcome of a divorce between two individuals who built a life together during the early years of a technology company. Her voice remained steady and calm. However, the evidence presented today has revealed that the question before the court is not simply about the dissolution of a marriage. Daniel Whitmore looked toward the bench, his expression serious now, his earlier certainty completely gone. Judge Hayes continued. The court must determine the value of contributions made during that marriage. She glanced briefly toward the stack of documents again before lifting her eyes back to the room. In many cases, those contributions are difficult to measure. The quiet attention of everyone present remained fixed on her words. But in this case, the evidence provides unusually clear documentation. Rebecca Lawson remained standing beside the podium, her posture relaxed yet attentive. Judge Hayes continued speaking with the same calm authority that had guided the entire hearing. Over the course of this proceeding, the court has reviewed financial models, restructuring strategies, investment reports, and valuation analyses. She paused briefly before continuing. Each of those documents identifies Maya Carter as the individual responsible for designing the financial architecture that supported Whitmore Tech during its earliest and most vulnerable years. Daniel's gaze dropped briefly toward the table before returning to the judge. Judge Hayes continued. Without those financial systems, the company may not have survived long enough for its technology to succeed. The reporters in the back rows wrote quickly, the faint movement of their pens the only sound in the room. Judge Hayes leaned slightly forward. It is also important to recognize that the contributions made by Ms. Carter were not casual or temporary. They represent strategic decisions that influence the long-term growth of the company. Daniel remained silent. Judge Hayes looked directly toward him now. Mr. Whitmore, you have built a remarkable technology company. That achievement is not in question. Daniel nodded once, though the gesture carried no trace of pride now. Judge Hayes continued. But the evidence before this court shows that the financial framework supporting that company was created through the work of Maya Carter. The words settled across the courtroom once more. Maya Carter remained composed, her calm presence unchanged even as the significance of the statement echoed through the room. Judge Hayes lifted the independent valuation report again and glanced briefly at its conclusion. The analysis provided by the independent valuation firm concludes that the financial systems designed by Ms. Carter significantly increased the long-term enterprise value of Whitmore Tech. She placed the report back on the desk and folded her hands together again. In other words, the company's success cannot be separated from the financial architecture that allowed it to grow. Daniel Whitmore sat quietly, the reflection of the courtroom lights visible across the polished surface of the table. The story he had told the world for years was no longer standing alone. Judge Hayes continued speaking, her voice calm and authoritative. The purpose of this court is not to rewrite history. She paused briefly before finishing the thought. But it is the responsibility of this court to recognize the full truth when that history is examined. Rebecca Lawson allowed herself a small breath as the statement settled across the room. For years, Maya Carter's work had existed quietly in the background of Whitmore Tech's rise. The financial strategies she designed had allowed the company to survive uncertainty, attract investment, and scale responsibly. Yet the public story of that success had rarely acknowledged the mind behind those systems. Now that truth had finally been laid out in the open, Judge Hayes glanced briefly toward Maya Carter. "Ms. Carter, your contributions were substantial." Maya inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, but remained silent. Judge Hayes looked once more across the courtroom before speaking again. "This court will now determine the financial value associated with those contributions." The quiet that followed carried a new sense of clarity. The evidence had spoken. The documents had told their story. And the woman who had spent years standing quietly behind the empire of Whitmore Tech was no longer invisible inside the room, where that empire's true foundation had finally been recognized. The quiet clarity that settled across the courtroom after Judge Eleanor Hayes spoke seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the room. The earlier tension that had filled the air when the hearing began had gradually been replaced by something steadier, something closer to understanding. The story that everyone believed when the morning started had slowly been taken apart piece by piece, and what remained now was not a dramatic revelation, but a careful reconstruction of the truth. Daniel Whitmore sat motionless for a moment, his hands resting flat against the table as though he were grounding himself in the reality of the moment. The confident smile that once defined his public image had disappeared hours earlier. In its place was the quiet reflection of a man who understood that the narrative he had carried into the courtroom was no longer standing alone. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her posture straight, her expression calm. She had not fought for attention during the hearing. She had not interrupted or argued. Instead, she allowed the documents, the timelines, and the careful testimony to speak for her. The result had slowly reshaped the entire room. Judge Eleanor Hayes adjusted the final pages of the report before her and looked once more across the courtroom. "This court has carefully reviewed the evidence presented throughout this hearing," she said in a steady voice. The reporters in the back row leaned slightly forward, their pens ready. "The documentation clearly demonstrates that Maya Carter played a substantial role in the financial design and strategic stability of Whitmore Tech during its earliest years." Daniel Whitmore remained silent as the judge continued. "Financial architecture is not simply an administrative task," Judge Hayes said. "It is the structure that allows a company to survive long enough for innovation to succeed." She paused briefly before continuing. "The evidence shows that the systems created by Ms. Carter provided Whitmore Tech with that structure." The words were not delivered with drama. They were delivered with the calm authority of a conclusion reached after careful examination. Judge Hayes lifted the independent valuation report one final time. The court also recognizes the analysis provided by the independent valuation firm. According to that analysis, the financial systems designed by Maya Carter significantly increased the long-term enterprise value of Whitmore Tech. The room remained silent as the meaning of those words settled over everyone present. Judge Hayes lowered the report back to the desk. For that reason, the court concludes that Maya Carter's contributions represent a measurable and substantial share of the value created during the marriage. Daniel Whitmore finally moved slightly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the bench as the judge continued. "This court therefore recognizes those contributions in the financial determination of this divorce settlement." She paused briefly before delivering the final decision. "Maya Carter will receive a significant equity-based compensation reflecting the value her work created within Whitmore Tech." The faint sound of several reporters drawing quick breaths moved through the back rows before they resumed writing rapidly. The decision had been delivered without spectacle, yet its impact was unmistakable. Daniel Whitmore lowered his eyes toward the table for a moment, absorbing the finality of the ruling. Years earlier, he had believed the story of Whitmore Tech belonged entirely to him. But now that story had been rewritten in a courtroom where the evidence spoke louder than reputation. Judge Hayes continued calmly. "This ruling does not diminish the leadership and vision that helped Whitmore Tech grow into a successful technology company." She looked briefly toward Daniel. But success is rarely built by one individual alone. Daniel nodded slowly, the movement quiet but sincere. Across the aisle, Maya Carter remained composed. The recognition she received did not appear to change her posture or her calm expression. For years her work had existed quietly in the background of a company that eventually became one of the most admired technology firms in the industry. Now that work had finally been acknowledged in the most public way possible. Judge Hayes gathered the documents in front of her and placed them neatly into a single stack. "The court is adjourned," she said. The gavel struck once against the wooden block, the sound echoing briefly through the room before fading into silence. For a moment no one moved. Then the quiet energy of the courtroom returned all at once. Reporters began gathering their notes, whispering quickly to one another as they prepared to send their stories out into the world. Attorneys collected their documents and exchanged brief professional nods. Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a few seconds longer before standing slowly. When he finally looked across the aisle toward Maya Carter, the expression on his face carried none of the dismissive confidence he had shown earlier that morning. Instead, there was a quiet recognition in his eyes, the understanding that the truth revealed inside the courtroom had changed the story forever. Maya met his glance calmly. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, only the steady dignity that had defined her presence throughout the entire hearing. After a moment, she gathered the small folder resting in front of her and rose from her chair. The sunlight filtering through the tall courthouse windows caught the edge of the polished floor as she walked toward the exit, her steps calm and unhurried. Outside the courthouse, the city continued its usual rhythm, traffic moving along the streets and people walking quickly through the afternoon. Yet inside the courtroom, a story that once belonged to headlines and business profiles had quietly transformed into something more honest. It was no longer the story of a single visionary founder standing alone at the top of a successful empire. It was the story of two minds working side by side during the uncertain years when the future of that empire was still fragile. And as Maya Carter stepped out into the light beyond the courthouse doors, the recognition she had earned did not come with applause or celebration. It came with something far more powerful. It came with the quiet certainty that the truth had finally been seen.